evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Rebecca Munro and this is Scotland at 7. Up first is our daily coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 2,378,191 people in Scotland have just been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,052,856 have been confirmed negative. 325,335 have tested positive. There are 2,047 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are 5 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 7,796. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 532 were in hospital last night, 48 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 3,963,502 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 2,940,202 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures were not published at the time this report was compiled. Now on to our first story, which is more than 100 are found dead in European floods. The death toll from catastrophic floods in Western Germany and Belgium has risen to more than 100, local authorities have said, as their emergency services continued their search for hundreds still missing. Authorities in the German state of Rhineland-Palatinate said 50 people had died there, including at least 9 residents of an assisted living facility for people with disabilities, while neighbouring North Rhine-Westphalia put the death toll at 43. Officials warned the figures could rise further. About 1,300 people in the devastated Arweiler district of Rhineland-Palatinate remain unaccounted for, although efforts to contact them were being hindered by badly damaged phone networks. Belgium authorities said the country's death toll had risen to 12, with 5 still missing. Most of the dead were found around Liège, a city of 200,000 people, despite an order for residents of central districts and areas bordering the Meuse River to evacuate. The army has been sent to 4 of the country's 10 provinces to help with rescue operations and evacuations, with residents of some towns, including the resort of Spa, which has been underwater since late on Tuesday, accommodated in tents. While they have so far suffered no loss of life, Switzerland, Luxembourg and the Netherlands were also severely affected, with flash floods sweeping through the Swiss villages of Schleichheim and Begingen. Several towns in the Grand Duchy evacuated on Thursday, and thousands were told to leave their homes in the southern Dutch city of Maastricht. The water levels in the Maas, as the Meuse River is known in Dutch, reached its maximum forecast height in Maastricht on Thursday night, but stayed below what authorities had termed the doom scenario, averting widespread flooding. Bridges across the river remained closed, however, and as residents began returning to their homes on Friday morning, others in towns and villages further downstream were being told to leave. At least 550 households were evacuated in Roermond. By far the highest death toll was in Germany, where rescuers on Friday were focusing their efforts on helping people trapped in their homes in the town of Erfstadt, southwest of Cologne, where numerous houses were at risk of collapse after floodwaters weakened and exposed their foundations. More rain is forecast for parts of the region, where water levels in the Rhine and its tributaries are rising dangerously. More than 1,000 soldiers have been deployed to help with rescue operations and rubble clearing in affected towns and villages. Our next headline of the evening is that Scottish Government demands UK ministers respect devolution. The UK Government will undermine devolution if they establish free ports in Scotland and Wales without reaching agreement with devolved governments, according to Scottish and Welsh ministers. Despite both devolved governments remaining committed to working with the UK Government, UK ministers have signalled their intention to move forward without devolved consent and have failed to provide assurances they will not legislate in devolved areas. Scottish and Welsh ministers will robustly challenge any attempt by the UK Government to legislate in devolved matters. Ministers are also seeking urgent clarity from the UK Government on joint decision-making and funding allocations, as UK ministers have been unwilling to guarantee that funding for ports in Scotland and Wales would match amounts being offered in England. The Scottish Government has been trying to work with the UK Government to ensure the UK Freeport proposal reflects the needs of businesses and communities in Scotland. Adapting UK Government proposals, new Scottish Green Ports would aim to offer a package of assistance to businesses that adopt fair work practices and contribute to Scotland's just transition to a net zero emissions economy. The Welsh Government has again written to the UK Government asking for an urgent discussion on how they can take these plans forward, given there has yet to be a formal offer made for a Freeport to be established in Wales. Our next story is England's COVID-19 prevalence rises rapidly to 1 in 95. The prevalence of COVID-19 infections in England is estimated to have risen to 1 in 95 people in the week to July the 10th, Britain's Office for National Statistics said on Friday, up sharply from the 1 in 160 recorded the week before. In England, the percentage of people testing positive for coronavirus continued to increase in the week ending the 10th of July 2021, according to the ONS statement. The ONS estimate that 577,700 people within the community population in England have COVID-19, which equates to around 1 in 95 people. Meanwhile, more than 1,200 scientists backed a letter to the Lancet journal warning that Boris Johnson's plan to lift virtually all of England's pandemic restrictions on Monday could allow the vaccine-resident variants to develop and was a threat to the world. Our next story is Shell and Scottish Power submit plans for floating offshore wind farms in the North East. Royal Dutch Shell has joined forces with Scottish Power to develop the world's first large-scale floating offshore wind farms in the north east of Scotland. The energy companies have submitted multiple plans for a string of large floating offshore wind farms to Crown Estate Scotland as part of the property manager's latest leasing round for access to the coastline. Floating turbines, which have no fixed subsea foundations, are a relatively new technology that will play a key part in the government's plan for an offshore wind boom because they can be developed in areas of very deep water where traditional offshore wind farms are not feasible. The new venture is expected to build on Scottish Power's track record as one of the biggest offshore wind developers in the UK and Shell's decades-long experience working in the hostile waters of the North Sea. Scotland's upcoming leasing round for offshore wind rights will be the first in more than a decade and will include floating wind farms for the first time. Crown Estate Scotland is expected to announce the results of this round of ScotWind leasing in early 2020. Our next story is ExxonMobil signs MOU to participate in Scotland's Acorn CCS project. ExxonMobil has signed a Memorandum of Understanding to participate in a carbon capture and storage project in Scotland, the US oil and gas producer said on Friday. The Acorn CCS project plans to capture and store approximately 5 to 6 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year by 2030 from gas terminals at the St Fergus complex at Peterhead, which includes ExxonMobil's joint venture gas terminal. Once expanded, it aims to store more than 20 million tonnes of carbon emissions a year by the mid-2030s. ExxonMobil has more than 30 years' experience in CCS technology and is advancing plans for multiple new CCS opportunities around the world, according to Joe Blumart, president of Low Carbon Solutions at ExxonMobil. CCS traps emissions and buries them underground, but is not yet at the commercialisation stage. The Acorn project is being led by a wholly owned subsidiary of Storegga Geotechnologies, Pale Blue Energy, with support from Macquarie Group, with a 21.5% shareholding, and Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund GIC, with a 15.4% shareholding. Exxon, which posted a loss of $22.4 billion last year, is under pressure from shareholder groups to shift to cleaner fuels. Exxon has pledged to increase spending on low-carbon projects and lower the intensity of its greenhouse gas emissions. Our next story is GB News shows attracted 0 viewers after boycott overtaking the knee. GB News attracted 0 viewers during some of its broadcasts this week, according to official television audience figures produced by rating agency Barb, after a viewer boycott prompted by one of its presenters taking the knee in solidarity with the England football team. The channel has now said that the decision of Guto Hari to make the on-air gesture on Tuesday in solidarity against the racist abuse suffered by English players was an unacceptable breach of our standards. On Thursday night, the channel tweeted, GB News stands 4 square against racism in all its forms. We do not have a company line on taking the knee. Some of our guests have been in favour, some against. All are anti-racist. We have editorial standards that all GB News journalists uphold. However, it then also tweeted, "On Tuesday, a contributing presenter took the knee live on air, and this was an unacceptable breach of our standards. We let both sides of the argument down by oversimplifying a very complex issue." Our next story is funding for affordable homes. Council areas across Scotland are to share more than £3.2 billion in grant funding over 5 years to deliver more affordable homes. Local authorities will benefit from an increase of more than £541 million on the previous 5-year allocation, an uplift of more than 20%. Housing Secretary Shauna Robinson said that the Scottish Government had already delivered more than 102,000 affordable homes since 2007, and building on this, their aim is to deliver 100,000 affordable homes by 2032, with at least 70% of these for social rent. Ms Robinson said, "Meeting this ambition will require continued collaboration across the private and public sectors. I'm pleased to be increasing significantly the available affording housing grant funding for council areas to help with this important work. The 5-year allocations aim to provide the certainty and assurance the housing sector needs to deliver the ambitious affordable homes targets set out in the Housing to 2040 strategy." And our last story of this evening is Belarus women's solidarity. Belarus President in exile, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, has declared July the 16th the Day of Belarus Women's Solidarity and has called on international friends to support the courageous women of Belarus. She invited friends to make and post videos on social media and to support the repressed in Belarus. She also encouraged writing letters to political prisoners. And we are now joined by Patricia Gibson MP, who is the SNP's Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government from this year in 2021. She's been the Member of Parliament for North Ayrshire and Arran since successfully winning the seat during the 2015 general election. Patricia has been a passionate advocate for statutory paid bereavement leave for all employees who have sadly had to endure the loss of a close family member or partner. On tonight's programme, we will be discussing this bill and its importance for citizens, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, welcome Patricia, it's great to have you on the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you for inviting me.
It's no problem at all. So, just to start off with, I wanted to mention how you helped to secure paid bereavement leave for parents who had suffered the loss of a child up to 18 years old, and that this was successfully enshrined in law in April. So, is this a big achievement for you, or was it perhaps maybe something that you thought was slightly overdue?
Yes, well, the paid bereavement leave that we currently have in place for parents who lose a child up to the age of 18, it was a magnificent cross-party effort, and it was really positive to see politicians from all different parties working together to secure this. And for the SNP, you know, I was very keen that we push this forward, because, as you know, the situation as such has been for too long that when you lose a child, what happens is that you're entirely at the discretion of your employer as to whether or not you will have any paid bereavement leave at all. Now, we know that a lot of employers are understanding. We also know that not all employers are as understanding and supportive as they could be. But I think enshrining losing a child up to the age of 18 in law recognises the life-changing and far-reaching and profound event that is. And as an amendment to that bill, I was also happy that my amendment was accepted, which meant that if you had a stillbirth, then 2 weeks was added on to your maternity and paternity leave, again recognising the profound nature of that loss. And now as we move forward, I think it's time, especially, but not just because of, but you know, in the context of a global pandemic, now is a good time. Given the losses that have been suffered, nearly 153 people have died across the UK in this pandemic. That's a huge amount of loss. And I think it's now the time for statutory paid bereavement leave for everybody who loses a close family member. I think the time for that has come.
Yes, so was it actually during this process of creating obviously the stillborns and up to 18-year-olds, was it this process that kind of made you realise that why not have bereavement leave, paid leave for close family members and partners?
Well, I remember that it was quite a momentous and actually quite an emotional day in the Commons, certainly for me, when this initial bill on statutory paid bereavement leave for people who lose a child up to 18, when that was passed in the Commons, it was a very significant milestone. But I remember on that day, whilst recognising how momentous and historic that achievement was, that we'd managed to get this through the Commons, I remember standing up in the Commons on that day and saying, it's still not enough, but it's a hugely significant step. And the work now on my new bill is building on that prior success and recognition of the fundamental impact that bereavement has on individuals and society as a whole.
Yeah, and just for clarification on this new bill, what is the definition of closeness? Like, what is considered to be, or who is considered to be, a close family relative?
Well, this is the sort of thing that we could thrash out at committee stage if the bill was to proceed. I mean, for me, it would be somebody who is, an immediate member of your family.
Right.
But I recognise that there are circumstances in which, for some individuals, for some circumstances, that might not be an appropriate definition. These are things that I'm quite happy to debate, and go toe-to-toe on, if it comes to it. But I think we need to establish the principle that if you lose a close relative, and you can define close, we can talk about that, that as a society we recognise the extent of that loss.
Yeah, and to move on to your speech for the motion of the bill, I was watching it and I was struck by one fact, and that was that a third of employees who experienced a bereavement over the past year didn't receive any communication from managers or the leadership of their organisation about bereavement. I mean, why is there such a lack of communication on this topic?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think even now in society, there is still a bit of a taboo around death. People don't like to talk about it. People don't know how to broach it. People are worried they'll say the wrong thing. And that is why I think quite often people who suffer a profound loss very often speak about feeling isolated. And it's not that those around them don't care. It's that there is a silence still around much of bereavement in society. And the fact that a third of employees didn't receive any communication, I think, points to that. I also think that employers often think, well, it's not really for the workplace,
Right.
And if people need to take a couple of days off, fine, they may or may not be paid, but there's not really any established recognition of it in the workplace. I don't think employers think about having established procedures about what to do when this happens and what support may be available to their employees.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, for the employees as well, when someone close to you passes, the last thing you want to be doing is talking about when you need to go back to work and, having these difficult conversations with your employer. So how can employees be made aware of their employer's bereavement policies?
Well, in actual fact, I think you might find that a lot of employers don't have bereavement policies as such.
Right.
They deal with things on an ad hoc basis, and that might work for some employers, but the important thing is that bosses communicate with their employees about how they can help them through that difficult period, about what discretionary leave they'll give them, whether or not they're willing to pay them, how much time they're willing to give them off. These are all things, you see, so much of it is ad hoc and discretionary, and that isn't good enough. If we had bereavement leave enshrined in law, a lot of other things would happen in workplaces to accommodate that. There would be established procedures, there would be conversations, and there would be a space provided for those who had lost somebody to around that very, very difficult time.
So is there anything at all in place right now about bereavement awareness and making it kind of mandatory?
Well, some big named employees like the Co-op, for example, have done a lot of good work on this. And that has been, sadly, a matter for the Co-op. But there has to be, I think, enshrined in law, a societal recognition of this. We can't have one employer doing great work on this and really blazing a trail, while other employers either haven't thought about it or don't quite know what they should be doing. I think there has to be, bereavement is something that touches every single one of us at some time in our lives. We all understand or fear that we will have to understand the pain of losing somebody really, really close. So we've all got a vested interest in recognising that death is a great leveller, and it's something that we all have to deal with. And we really need, as a society, to establish parameters that provide spaces at that time for people to grieve, because there's a cost to not doing so. Now, if you speak to a government minister, they will tell you, oh, there's a cost to this, there's a cost to this, but there's also quite a significant financial and social cost to not doing this.
Yeah, and regarding raising awareness, do you think that this is the responsibility of the employer or the government, or a bit of both?
Well, as I say, some employers are doing good work in this, but it isn't fair to the workforce that how much support and understanding and space you have to grieve is entirely at the discretion of your employer. Because that means that two people who suffered profound losses might have very, very different experiences in the workplace from their bosses. So we need government to legislate. This should be statutorily recognised, and that means that employers would then make the arrangements, because they're under legal obligation to do so, to put this in place. And some employers are doing this very well off their own bat, but it shouldn't be discretionary. It should be for everybody.
So should there be a law in which it's necessary for employers to make it clear what their bereavement policies are to employees?
Well, the most fundamental thing an employer can do is to do what the bill asks, and that is to ensure that people have 2 weeks statutory paid bereavement leave. Now, beyond that, you might have employers who will offer support services, who might have a counsellor. It depends on the size of your place of work and the number of employees. Smaller employers will perhaps have less resources to do these things, but the important thing as well is the human recognition. If there's a 2 week space for everybody, then some employers will supplement that with counselling or support or advice or whatever it is, and other employers may simply just put in informal arrangements. But the key thing is the 2 weeks paid bereavement leave, because that space after that initial trauma of loss is really, really important, and it needs to be backed up by being paid leave, because there's a lot of cost involved in bereavement, and it's something we don't often talk about, but there's cost to bereavement as well as the emotional shock. So people, as you said earlier in the interview, people can't be having this 2 weeks bereavement leave and worrying about how they're going to pay their bills as a result of lost pay.
Yeah, and I mean, do you yourself have any plans on how to make employees aware of this bill that you're doing just now if it's passed? Because supposedly some employers might not tell them about this bill, and employees have no idea that they have this right.
Well, I would expect, if this bill was to pass and become law, I would expect that there would be some level of, as is often the case with legislation, there would be some level of consultation with employers, mainly to make sure that employers could feed into the process, and they would understand what was going on, and they could be given perhaps transition periods to prepare if that was deemed necessary. So, just like now sick pay is something that we all know about, statutory paid bereavement leave would become, I think, fairly quickly something that employers and employees would become aware of.
Yeah, and you said that that right now, basically, they're not. It's based on the discretion of the employer. Does this not maybe create an unhealthy work environment? Maybe if an employer deems someone should get more pay than other, is this really damaging in the workplace?
I think it's very damaging, and it's quite disheartening. I mean, I've heard examples of employers, going really out of their way to be as supportive as they can be when somebody in their workforce suffers a traumatic loss, and that kind of attitude for employers has to be applauded and as a template for how things can be done. I've also heard stories of other employers who are not so supportive, who either are not happy about giving time off, or if they do give time off, it's not paid. And it's worth noting that the lower salary that you earn, the less likely you are to have any paid bereavement leave at all. So it discriminates. The current situation discriminates against those in low pay, those who can least afford to lose pay when they're dealing with bereavement and loss. So it's very unequal, and it's not socially just. It's not enlightened, and I think if we want a more productive and a more productive workforce with a greater sense of well-being, then this is the sort of things that we need to be doing across the board. It can't be, one set of rules for one group of workers and one set of rules for another. When it comes to death and loss, we're all the same.
Yeah, and are there certain groups of people or certain demographics of people that are going to be more deeply affected by inconsistent bereavement policies?
Yes, like I say, the more disadvantaged you are socioeconomically, the more disadvantaged you are by this ad hoc discretionary situation we have at the moment. And when you suffer a loss, quite often, I have to say, it comes with a loss of income to the household. It comes with the cost of a funeral, and your other bills keep coming in; they don't stop. So it's very sudden loss is very often a really financially distressing time while you're trying to cope with the loss of the loved one. So if you're in difficult financial circumstances anyway, then piling this on top actually interferes with the grieving process. And we know that if we think about the pandemic, we know that 24% of all employees have experienced a loss in the last 12 months. And we also know that for every death, 6 people suffer intense and profound grief. And that isn't going to go away any quicker when you're having a difficult time at work, when you're coming back to work and worrying about your bills. So if we can support people through that very difficult time, they're more likely to stay in work, to be actively contributing to the economy, and they're less likely to rely on support from the state, whether that be DWP support, whether that be NHS support. So actually, if we support people at the right time, we get better, healthier, more resilient citizens in the end, and a more productive workforce.
Yeah, and are people who live in more socio-economically challenging conditions, are they more likely to experience difficulties not just in coping financially, but also in getting the kind of the appropriate help from supported services?
Yeah, we know that. Sue Ryder is actually, the charity Sue Ryder has done a lot of work, a lot of research on this, and what we know is that you are more likely to grieve for longer in a more persistent way and less likely to have access to the kind of support that might help you to start to begin to recover emotionally. And the reasons for that are likely to be because if the lower down the socioeconomic scale that you are, the less likely you are to be able to have access to the kind of support you need, whether that's because you're more isolated socially, whether that's because you're not quite sure what services are available, so therefore you don't access them. There could be a number of reasons for that. But we know that the class divide, sadly, bleeds into the grieving process in a way that it ought not to.
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned that for every death, 6 people experience intense grief. Has COVID actually exacerbated this?
Well, if you think about it, it's hard to believe that it hasn't, because remember, when you suffer a loss during this pandemic, because of the public health restrictions, you can't make the connections with other members of your family who are also suffering that loss. you're separated from your loved ones, so you perhaps haven't had an opportunity to say goodbye, you perhaps haven't had an opportunity to spend time with them in the run-up to their passing, you're not able to perhaps rely on the communal family support to help you cope with the loss. So it's hard to see how during COVID that loss hasn't been exacerbated because of the kind of socially difficult circumstances we're in terms of public health restrictions. So if anything, COVID not only has brought profound loss to many people, to many people before their time. People have died prematurely, but also those left behind have suffered deeper grief, I think, because of the restrictions that I've mentioned.
Yeah, and even just the limitations of funerals during COVID. I mean, it all adds up.
Absolutely.
And just, it creates more issues for people in grief. So definitely. So, I mean, with this exacerbation due to COVID, should this bill have been brought in even sooner, maybe as almost an emergency bill of compassion?
Well, you see, I think given the circumstances of COVID-19, you know, in ordinary circumstances, people could have had a debate about this, about when it should be brought in, the extent to which it should be brought in. But I think the COVID pandemic has changed everything, and it should also, I think, have reshaped our attitude to loss and grief, because collectively across the UK there has been profound outpourings of grief because of the nature of the loss, the random cruelty of the losses, and the way that people have been separated and unable to grieve in the way that they traditionally would have been able to do. So I think COVID-19 has shown us that life, perhaps not shown us, but reminded us that life is random, loss is cruel, and collectively, I think it's a good time for us to come together and recognise the importance of enshrining that, recognising that in law. So I think COVID-19 has created, sadly, it has created circumstances that have highlighted how fundamentally important a measure like this is.
Yeah, no, definitely. And and what are the long-term effects of people suffering from intense grief, perhaps regarding, mental and physical health, more generally and more specifically in the workplace?
Well, actually, from societal, what we know is that people who suffer intense grief, a loss from which they're really struggling to cope, they're more likely to die within 2 years of that loss than would otherwise be the case. We know they're more likely within 2 years to have heart attacks and diabetes and other health complications. We know that they're more likely to, depending if it's a wage earner in the household, they're more likely to get into financial difficulties from which it's difficult to escape. They're more likely to perhaps even drop out of the workforce because of the way that their grief has affected them, and perhaps that's exacerbated by an employer who's not quite as supportive as you would hope. They're more likely to rely on NHS services for the health problems I've talked about, but also perhaps for mental health support, counselling support. So there's a real social cost, and there's a real cost to society on this. So yes, this bill will cost the Exchequer money, but it's actually, I view it as preventative spend, because you're spending money to, in the end, not only save money, but to build a more fair and more just society with a greater sense of well-being at its heart. And can you really put a price on that?
Yeah, so is it a balancing kind of between compassionate factors but also considering economic factors?
Yeah, well, the economic factors are always the first consideration of the Treasury, who ultimately would have to approve these measures. The Treasury is always looking at the numbers, and that's fine. But, if they want to look at the numbers, there's a sound economic case for doing this. I mean, I think as a compassionate measure, that's where you can sell this idea. That's where its importance lies. But for those who want to crunch the numbers and want to talk about, can we afford this? Is this money well spent? Can the country, provide this kind of, can the UK economy provide this kind of support at this time? You've got to set up against the backdrop of the savings, the economic savings it will make for the Treasury. I mean, if you look at the savings for the Treasury, it is estimated that the loss to the Treasury of bereavement is estimated at £23 billion per year. Okay, so sorry, it costs the economy £23 billion per year. It costs the Treasury £8 billion. So there's some hard numbers, and of course some estimates put the costs even higher than that. So I think what we want to do is to support citizens in the workplace, keep people in the workplace, keep them economically active, look after their health, their mental health, their emotional health, and ultimately that's how you get a better society.
So we're talking about billions of pounds here that could be saved. So I mean, surely then the Treasury would want to support bereavement paid leave to just ensure a successful return to work and productivity as well, that people actually feel comfortable and want to return back if they feel that they've been looked after well.
Yeah, I mean, when on surveys of people who have suffered a loss, what the research has shown, that those who felt supported by their employer upon the return to work, 60% of them cited that being allowed enough time to grieve without being pressured to go back to work before they were ready played a significant part in their feeling ready to return to work. So we all know that when times are hard, support is worth its weight in gold. It's also makes for a more productive workforce as well, because you feel valued. You feel that your loss matters. You see, and the problem is if you're in a job where bereavement leave is quite hard to come by, when you get it, it's not paid. It's like, whether it's intentional or not, it's like your employer is saying that the profound loss that you have suffered doesn't actually matter. Now, I'm sure that's not what the bosses are saying, but in the fog of grief, that's how it must appear.
Yeah,
and that's not good for productivity levels either for your boss. So it's actually counterproductive.
of course, yeah. And one thing I was thinking about is that obviously people do deal with grief differently, and some people do need perhaps more time than others. So can there ever be a right amount of time off work, like a one size fits all? And how is this decided?
Well, it's interesting. That's a very good question. When we were piloting through committee stage and in the Commons the paid bereavement leave for parents who'd lost a child up to the age of 18, we had a lot of conversation, because we wanted to get this right. We had a lot of conversation about whether or not people would take the 2 weeks. And there's no compulsion to take the 2 weeks. I mean, certainly when what we know is that for some men in particular, and I'm speaking about my husband, when we lost our baby at full term, when we had a stillbirth, my husband's way of coping with it was to keep busy. And for a lot of people, that is what they need to do, because, as you say, people grieve very, very differently. Other people need to stop, take a step back, and try and come to terms with what's happened. And other people, the other thing that we had to consider was that some people, while they're entitled to 2 weeks paid bereavement leave, they may want to keep busy, but the shock of the loss might hit them 2, 3, 4 months down the line. That's actually very common. So there has to be a level of flexibility built into this leave, the way that it was built in very sensitively to the paid bereavement leave for those who lost a child up to the age of 18. Because grief is different for everybody who experiences it, and people deal with it in different ways, and the arrangements have to be sensitive to that.
Yeah, and you mentioned near the beginning of the interview about how there was a lot of cross-party support for this bill. I mean, does this speak for itself and how important this bill actually is, and that it has to be passed?
Well, I actually think that there is a lot of support for this bill. I think COVID-19 has persuaded people that this is something that really ought to happen now. to be honest with you, I don't know if it will pass this year, next year, the year after. But I do, and I don't know if I'll be around to see it. But I do think that we will reach a stage at some point where this measure will happen, and it will become as accepted and as understood as a right in the workplace as sick leave is at the moment. You know, I think it's really important. I think it will happen, and you know, it may not be this bill that I'm putting forward, but I believe that one day it will happen. And, you know, I just hope it happens sooner rather than later, because every day that passes, there are people who are suffering huge loss, great loss, and are perhaps not getting the space and the support that they need to help them through that.
Yeah, and as you've mentioned, you know, this affects everyone. So is there wide support for this out with Parliament as well, for this bill?
Yes. All the evidence suggests that this is very, very much supported by the public, because and quite often, you know, the public are ahead of you know, politicians in parliaments on some of these social matters. The public are keen to see such a measure adopted, of course, and many of the people who are supportive of it will themselves understand, having been through perhaps a situation that wasn't as supportive as it could have been. I think there's a collectively as a society, we're understanding the impact of loss. I think COVID-19 has sadly taught us that as one of its lessons. And I think if it were to be brought in, it would have much greater support. And one of the things I'm trying to do as well is to raise awareness of it, because there's a lot of people out there who won't know that I'm doing this, but if they did know, they would be extremely supportive. You know, it's one of these ideas that we really should be pushing an open door, because it makes sense on every measure.
Yes, so I mean, if you're thinking that if you increase the awareness of this bill, more people might be in favour of it, I mean, do some people just simply believe that something like this already exists, just as a common courtesy?
Well, do you know, it's funny, because when we were passing through the parental bereavement bill in 2019, when I was speaking to people and I was putting things on social media, a lot of people were actually surprised to find that there was no such thing as paid bereavement leave. You know, maybe because they when they're maybe they had a positive experience, and their bosses were so supportive that they thought that was just how it was. But there's equally a lot of people who will tell you that, you know, they have not had such a positive experience, and it's that divide that I'm deeply uncomfortable about. You know, that some people have such different experiences when they're suffering equally, but there is an understanding, I think, that there has to be something like this in place. And as you say, there are some people out there who will assume that there are such measures in place when there's not.
Yeah, and I mean, given we're in the middle of a global pandemic and we've had an excess, I think, of about 152,000 deaths in the UK, I mean, should there not already be some clear systems in place? I mean, you would think that there would be. They can't be. People can't be faulted for thinking that, in place for grieving.
Absolutely, absolutely. But, you know, it goes back to what I said earlier. There is a lot of, even in this day and age, there is still a bit of a taboo around death. People don't like to talk about it. And you know, and it's the kind of thing people often don't think about it until it happens to somebody that they know or somebody in their family. And they just assume that, you know, arrangements are there that need to be there. But I think it really is an idea whose time has come, and there'll be a lot of people who have had negative experiences who will be looking at these measures and perhaps thinking about time, you know, and it really is it's long past time.
Yeah, and I mean, historically, are some employers just simply too embarrassed then to talk about it, or perhaps maybe too indifferent to chat to employees about losing a loved one? Is this is this one of the main problems that you're trying to mitigate?
Well, there is a bit, I suppose there is an element of that, but there are some employers who will tell employees, when they need time off to deal with a loss, they'll tell them to take it as holiday leave. It's not holiday leave. It's a profoundly life-changing event. Some of them might tell them just to take it as sick pay. But grief and sickness, they're quite different. Although I admit that if grief is not given the support that it needs, it can affect your health and make you ill. But I think we need to. We shouldn't be so scared of recognising the impact of grief. It is profound, and for every individual, it takes its toll in unique and far-reaching ways. And we shouldn't call it sickness, and we shouldn't call it holiday leave. We should call it what it is. It's bereavement leave. It's trying to reassemble yourself after you feel that your world's been turned on its head.
Yeah, and it's often said that how a government treats its most vulnerable is a direct reflection on its humanity. So, do you think this bill would be a progressive addition to the statute book? And do you think the House of Commons will recognise this progressive step that you're trying to make?
I think it is a very progressive step, and I think it's quite a fundamental step in terms of workers' rights. And I do hope the House of Commons recognises it. I know that there is sympathy for this bill, and it's what it's trying to do right across the House, both sides of the House. And I hope that the government will sit up and take notice. You can always find reasons to say, oh, it's too expensive, we can't afford to do it just now. But I would suggest to you that during a global pandemic, this is exactly the right time, perhaps, to do something like this. And like I say, there's a cost to doing it, but there's another cost. And some of the cost actually is beyond pennies and shillings and pound shillings and pence. There's a profound social cost. There's a productivity cost. There's an economic cost to not doing this. So, I really hope that, as we continue to talk about this, have a conversation about this, both in the Commons across the country. I really hope that the government will implement these measures.
Yeah, and so my final question to you, Patricia, is when are you hoping to see this bill enshrined in law?
Well, if it was up to me, it would be as quick as it could get through the House of Commons, and I think it takes. Well, you can do legislation as quickly or as slowly as you like, but I think the average time for it from starting to end, given that this is actually quite a straightforward measure, you could have it done and dusted in 6 months. I would like to have it on the statute book tomorrow. I would like to see progress on it as soon as possible. I suspect it will take a bit longer than that. I have been waiting for over a year to present this bill to Parliament, so I'm patient. And if the steps are slower than I would like, then I'm just going to have to be patient with that. But I think the end goal is worth waiting for, and I'll keep pushing. Like I said, when the very day when we had paid bereavement leave for parents who'd lost a child up to the age of 18, on that very day, I said, I'll be back. This doesn't go far enough, so I'll keep going.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia, for being here. I hope it all goes well for you as well. It's a difficult topic. It's a difficult topic, but a much needed one that needs to be said. So yes. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure and very informative as well. So thanks a lot for that. Thank you. And that is all for this evening. Thanks again to Patricia for coming on, and thank you to everyone watching at home. If you would like to support Broadcasting Scotland further, then just follow the link on the bottom of your screen just now. Thanks again for watching.